Hi, my name is Jeff, and this is my coming out story. Recently, I've been watching coming out stories of young people on YouTube and watching the struggles they have with dealing with fundamentalistic religions and conservative families and all the trauma of fearing what their friends might think. And comparing to myself and thinking I never went through any of that. And then I realized how different it was when I came out back in the 70s and dealing with my sexuality in the 60s. So this is my story. I'm now 71 years old. I'm a retired physician. I've lived outside the United States over 10 years, first in Mexico, and now I live on a small Dutch Caribbean island named Saba. So this cottage-like background is my 162-year-old house on the island. And the windows are open, so if you hear cars going by or roosters crowing, this is a very rural place. I grew up in Minnesota in a small town called Olivia, population 2,349, 100 miles west of the Twin Cities. My parents were business owners. My mother ran the only department store in the county, which she had inherited from her father. My grandfather died 2 months before I was born, so I never knew him. My father was one of the two pharmacists in town and had his own drugstore across the street. Because they went to work every day, we had a local farm girl who stayed with us during the school year, and she did the cooking, cleaning, and she was my other mother when I came home from school. She was with us from after harvest until school was out in the spring. So up until Halloween of the school year, I was home alone in the afternoon, and my mother had to keep doing the household as well as run the store. Fortunately, she had a good manager, and she could leave when she needed to. Diversity. Our town was not very diverse. There were no people of color there, and the first time you saw a black person or a brown person was if you went to Minneapolis or St. Paul. The diversity in our town was whether you were Catholic or Protestant, or whether you were Bohemian or not. Our town had been settled by Czech immigrants in the 1870s, and probably over half of the town was Bohemian, as they called themselves. The rest were German, Scandinavian, and other northern ethnicities that were all white. My own family was Norwegian on my father's side and British on my mother's side. As far as religious influence on feeling that gay was being bad, I had none, which was really nice because my father was the son of a Norwegian Lutheran Bible teacher, but my grandfather had died 10 years before I was born on that side, so I never knew him either. Unfortunately, it hadn't stuck much in my father, and he did not try to bring up any religious stuff at home. In fact, the church we went to was the more liberal branch of the Lutheran Church, so I got no pushback from the church about gay. In fact, I never even heard them mention homosexuality. My Catholic friends and the people that were in the Nazarene Church and the Jehovah's Witnesses, of course, imposed a bunch of rules and restrictions on their members, and we just accepted them as they were and knew that they couldn't do some things or had to confess things. And that was that. The Catholic kids went to their own school through 8th grade and then joined us in the 9th grade at the public school. So the town was small. The classes had about 50 people in them, and we all knew each other from kindergarten through high school. In fact, when we have class reunions, you sort of pick up where you left off, even though you haven't seen the people for 10 years. Because of our stores, we knew all the families because they were all our customers. So the graduating class was 87 with the Catholic kids added in. Friends. In school, it seems like everybody nowadays has huge groups of friends, and a lot of them are taken off the internet from social groups there. Of course, we had no internet back then. So I basically had two close friends in grade school and junior high, my next door neighbor, Brent, and a classmate of his, Dave. They were both a year younger. we were bonded by our love of stamp collecting, and we got together and traded stamps. And we did other things around town, but mostly it was Brent and I, because we had lived next door to each other since we were born. He was like a brother to me, which I didn't have. He had older siblings, and I had an older sibling, a sister who was 16 years older, so we really grew up with each other as surrogate brothers. Later in high school, I had 3 closer friends, and we were in German class together, and we were the advanced students. We had an exchange teacher from Germany our junior year, and she couldn't understand what we were doing in the class with the rest of them because we were so much advanced beyond them, so she jumped us up into the senior class, much to the chagrin of the seniors, because we were actually better at their level than they were. And so when our teacher returned for our senior year from his exchange in Germany, he had 3 students that had already done the whole course. So he got us the University of Minnesota course, and we spent the whole year in the language lab on our own studying it. So we got credit for 5 years of German in 4 years. And so those were my other friends. As far as coming out or dealing with your emotions of being attracted to men, well, I never knew what gay was, and back then I just thought, well, you know, I like guys, I'm a guy, I guess I can like them. And I always figured someday that would go away and I'd meet a nice woman and marry her and have kids and do the family thing. We had no pornography. There were no positive gay characters on TV. There were no stars or famous people that came out. There were no gay rights advocates back in the 60s. So there was rarely, if ever, anything about homosexuals in the news. In fact, I can't ever remember anything. So you discovered your sexuality basically by hearing about where babies came from. That usually happened about in the 4th grade, and we got all the details from a classmate of mine who had an older brother in the 8th grade. And so once Jeff found out, he's also named Jeff, from his brother, he of course came and told me. And incredulous as it sounded, I was skeptical, of course, and he said, no, it's true, you know, everything right down to the mechanics of ejaculation and how that made a baby. And I said I couldn't really believe that. And oh yeah, it's true. He said my brother does it and lets it go on my chest. And I thought, I didn't think that was weird at the time. I just thought, oh, well, I guess you have to believe the 8th grader, because if he's actually physically doing it, that's how babies are made. And years later I found out that was a kinky porn thing too. So of course I had to tell my good friend Brent, and I also told my friend Dave, but I told them separately. And neither one expressed any doubt. They thought the source of the information was valid, and we were still immature. However, we'd been urged on by Jeff to practice getting a boner, and someday we would get jazz. And so we would get together just individually, not all 3 of us, but I got together with Brent and Dave, and then I found out later Brent and Dave were getting together by themselves, and we never told each other. So we would practice masturbating, and even before you're mature, you can have kind of a juvenile orgasm, and it sort of feels good, and then you're done, you put your penis away and you go do something else. So we would do that pretty regularly. Finally in 6th grade, it happened. I called up my friends and told them that jazz had arrived one morning, and of course then we had to get together so I could demonstrate that to them individually. At that point, Brent and I started a fairly regular juvenile sexual relationship. His mother had arts club on Monday. The house was always empty. We'd go over there, and he would watch me masturbate, and he would try, and then finally, a year later or so, he was successful. We knew from Jeff's older brother that husbands and wives lay on top of each other and did that, and that the penis was inserted in the woman, and that's how babies were made. So we would tuck our genitals between our legs and lie on top of each other and rub each other to orgasm. And we called it playing Herbert and Emily, and we would switch the roles back and forth. So we each got off. So that was, I think, way more sexual activity than any of the young people nowadays ever express, unless they're just too shy to talk about what they did when they were young. But I actually think they dealt more with the emotions of coming out, having a boyfriend, dating, and then getting around to sex, because they already knew what gay sex was. They've watched porn, even though it says if you're 18, close this website. And they know everything the gay people do, and they say, okay, well, maybe someday I'll get around to that. So they didn't even have to wonder. For us, we didn't know any of that. We just did what came naturally. So between 6th grade and 9th grade, Brent and Dave and I had our individual relationships, and it was pretty regular. And then as I entered 9th grade, Dave moved away. So he moved to Iowa, and he was gone, so Brent and I continued on by ourselves. And I noticed he started getting an interest in girls, and it was less often, but we still did it. I thought I should be getting an interest in girls, but I was actually more interested in my classmates when they were naked in physical education class. And, well, maybe that'd go away later. You know, I figured when I got to college, I could do it then. So Brent started dating. I had no desire to date. I had my high school friends now, my 3 in the German class. And they were the only ones that ever came to my house, or I went to their house. Steve lived out on a farm, so it wasn't real convenient. He'd rather come to town. Brian was the son of the football coach, Fayed teacher, and he was also the vacuum cleaner salesman, and he was kind of an unusual character. And their house was in chaos most of the time. He had younger siblings, and so I didn't go over there very much. And my friend Jim's house, I spent a lot more time there. His mother was quirky and chronically depressed, said inappropriate things all the time, but it made life interesting. His father was a recovering alcoholic who was now dry, but his wife never let him forget about it. So, at one time or another, I had some sexual contact with all 3 of these. With Brian, the coach's son, we got together in the summer out at the lake 40 miles north of where we lived, where they would rent a cabin, and we owned a cabin. So when they were out there for 2 weeks, we got together. And he had an uncle who was only 2 or 3 years older, who also was interested in fooling around. So we 3 would masturbate together. We had a code word for it, we called it sending shipments. My friend Steve from the farm and I had one encounter. It was when we were seniors. I think it was around Christmas time. He came over, and we got drunk on some icky old Danish liqueur called cherry herring that was fermenting in my parents' liquor cabinet. It was probably 5 years old and no good, and we mixed it with orange juice and got a little high and loose from it. Well, Steve got really sick, and I think he thought he was going to have diarrhea, because he went to the downstairs bathroom and had his pants down around his ankles, and then he had to flip off the toilet and turn around and embrace it and Ralph up all his dinner. So I came down there to see if he was doing okay, and there he was, sort of half naked, with his penis hanging out and barfing, and of course I had my inhibitions released because of the liquor. So I started playing with his penis, and he got an erection, and once he was done throwing up, for some reason I just gave him oral. That was the first time I did that, and he just stood there and enjoyed it. And then when he was done, he did the same thing to me, which really surprised me. And okay, then I said, "You okay to go home?" And and that was it. So Monday in school, I thought, oh no, this is going to be awkward having to see him. And so I thought about it ahead of time, and I thought, well, he's going to say something, or I have to say something. So I had it planned. And indeed, we had lockers who were close to each other, and got there Monday morning. He looked at me sort of sheepishly and said, "Wow, that got kind of gross, didn't it?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean, you really barfed up a lot." Made no reference to the sex. And it was never mentioned again, not even at any reunion, even though he knew I was gay by then. My friend Jim and I think managed to masturbate together once when his parents were gone, but we didn't really do anything, but it did happen once. So that was sort of my experience in high school. I never dated a girl. There was a lot of guys that didn't date girls. There were sort of cliques. There were the jocks, and then the good-looking girls and the cheerleaders, and each one of them dated a jock, so they were all hooked up. Then there were the smart kids, and maybe a couple of them had a girlfriend or boyfriend between the smart girls and smart boys. Then there were the average grade students that were the nerds, and they were usually in chess club or audiovisual club because everything was on film back then, so the kids actually operated the projectors. And science club, and I was the president of German club and the newspaper editor, and I was in debate, declamation, one-act plays, class plays, band, anything except sports, because I wasn't interested in sports. So that kept me busy. It was also good, we had a dance band, and we played for all the minor dances, and I didn't have to worry about being chastised for not going to the dances with a date. I did go to junior and senior prom, and I took the exchange student from Thailand my senior year, and I think my junior year I took my standmate in band, Margaret. So, safe people. So, not dating in high school wasn't a big deal. Nobody gave me a bad time about it, because I would think half of our class didn't seem to be dating, unless I was missing out on something. But it was a small town, and you pretty much knew what everybody was doing. And when you went to sports events, of course, the band was always there. So even though I was not interested in sports, I always supported the teams. And I was always there in band and during halftime, in the stands, and you could see who was dating whom that way. So it was a very different environment back then. So I go to college. First went to a private liberal arts college called Carleton. It was very difficult. I was in pre-med. I had lots of competition from students from Minneapolis, Chicago, and New York. And I wasn't getting straight A's like I did in high school. I was also doing a major in German because I really loved language, but I decided that a career as a physician would be more fulfilling, and languages would just be my hobby. So I had to get the language stuff out of my system while I was in college. So my advisor said, "Why don't you transfer to the University of Minnesota, much better German program there than we have, more extensive." And I knew in my heart that there would be less competition in the pre-med courses, and I could do better there. So I transferred in my sophomore year. And this was in 68 to 70. So during that time, there was a lot of political upheaval. There were the race riots in LA, and they even happened in St. Paul, burned down sections of town. There was all the riots and demonstrations against the Vietnam War. When Nixon invaded Cambodia, the University of Minnesota campus broke out in all kinds of protests. The police came in and shot tear gas at us. I remember I was in classrooms. I think it was medical school by that time in the fall. It was still going on. And the tear gas was coming into our labs, and we were having to put wet rags over our eyes. It was awful. And so during that time, I likewise did not date anybody, but I was away from Olivia, and I was in a big city. So throughout the whole 4 years of college, I thought, okay, this is very serious. You have to start looking at girls, quit looking at guys. So I would walk down the mall on campus between classes, and I would make an effort to look at every girl's breasts, because that was the big topic of discussion in the dorm. That was what you're supposed to look at. And that would last a day or two, and then pretty soon I was back to checking the guy with her. And in those days, guys wore really tight pants, and so the male version of the breast package was quite visible in the crotch, and it was fun to check that out. And you could pretend you were looking at the girl. So that failed, and I thought, well, maybe I just need a little more time to get over this guy stuff. So I knew that I certainly couldn't act on it, because if the medical school found out, they would certainly not let me in. So, because you just couldn't be gay and be a doctor. So, my summer of my junior year, you apply for medical school about that time in the fall, and I think I'd already put the application in early in the spring. I believe I was already accepted by them, in fact. So I had a chance to go to Germany and work in a hospital. And my summer jobs had always been as an orderly, and I put myself through part of school by being an orderly at the University of Minnesota hospitals in the surgery department. So I got a job in a German hospital, and since I'd also worked in mental hospitals in Minnesota, that's the job I got in Germany. So I go over to Germany and work for 2 months in this Catholic mental hospital. Become friendly with the priest that's assigned to the hospital, and improve my German and have fun with the guys there. There was actually a school to learn to be a professional male orderly, which is actually a job in Germany. And if you were a conscientious objector to doing military service, you could do that instead, and then do 2 years of working in a hospital as a conscientious objector alternative to military service. So there were young guys my age doing that. And there was one employee that was sort of a Nelly gay man, so he got teased a lot. And there was one student who turned out to be gay, and somebody outed him to the administration, and they immediately kicked him out of the school and discharged him from his job. And that was it. So I thought, whoa, I'd better hold back on trying anything here, because here I was in a foreign country where nobody knew me, and then word wouldn't get back to the medical school if I actually maybe tried something gay. So I pulled my horns back in, and at the end of the 2 months I had about 2.5 weeks left to take some vacation. So I went to Munich for 4 days, and then I took a boat trip down the coast of what was then Yugoslavia, which is now Slovenia and Croatia, to the town of Dubrovnik. And while in Munich, I discovered what a tea room was. Of course, I didn't know that's what it was called, but that's a bathroom where you can pick up guys. And when I found the main bathroom of the Munich main railroad station was teeming with guys looking to pick up somebody, I had my first experience at being picked up. And this friendly guy took me next door to a smaller train station with a smaller bathroom, and we had oral sex inside one of the bathroom stalls. In Germany, the stall walls go all the way down to the floor, so unlike in the States where you can see if there's 2 people in a stall, in Germany that's not possible. It made it much easier. So I went back another time before I left. Actually, it was the day I was leaving for Yugoslavia, and met another guy, still remember his name, Dieter Boy, and we went to a park in the rain, and while holding an umbrella, he was on his knees giving me oral in a park at night. So after the experience with Steve and these 2 guys, and a third one was yet to happen, I really thought, I'm out, I'm gay. That's what it is. And I went to a couple gay bars in Munich and just observed and saw guys dancing and guys kissing and guys conversing, and I did some conversing, but that was it. On my way back to Paris to get my flight home, I had visited a family I had met at the University of Minnesota Hospital as I did translating for them when they came over. And I went and visited them in northern Germany, and on my way to Paris, a young man in the train station chatted me up, and I could tell he was interested, and he rode in my sleeper car with me as far as Düsseldorf. It was like a 28-minute ride, and during that time he was my third encounter where we were actually in a private space where we could, make out and have oral and not be worried somebody might catch us. So all those experiences brought me out. I get back to the States, I go back into the closet because I'm not going to do anything like that there. I don't know where to meet anybody, so that was it. I just figured I'll deal with this later. The summer after I graduated, which was 1971, before medical school started, I moved into the medical fraternity I was going to live in. And Rudy, the priest from the hospital in Germany, had been corresponding with me, and he said, boy, he'd like to come to America. He had so many things he wanted to see in America. And I said, well, okay, come on over. I've got free time. We can rent a car and we'll drive out to the Wild West, which all Germans want to see. So he came over, we rented a car, and we planned a trip to go out to the Badlands, through Yellowstone, through Las Vegas, where he actually knew a family that we could visit, on to LA, and then end up in San Francisco, where I had an unmarried older female cousin whom we could stay with. So we did that trip, and it never had occurred to me that Rudy might be gay. I figured as a priest he had to be celibate, but he always seemed very interested in us guys, and we were always invited up to his apartment. He lived with his mother, and she made German food for us, very friendly, and so that was kind of our social life there at the hospital in Germany. So we get out on our first trip. We get to Chamberlain, South Dakota. It was 106 degrees, hot. He'd never experienced that before. He was thrilled, though. He thought this was really interesting. We ate dinner. He liked gin sours. We had a couple gin sours at the bar afterwards, which lowered our inhibitions on both sides. Went back to the hotel room, got naked, threw ourselves into bed, and just had sex without even thinking about it. Making out and oral sex. And so that whole trip was, for me, sex morning, noon, and night with Rudy. And so that was the first time I actually slept with a man and made out with a man and cuddled with a man and had something ongoing. And then I knew that was right. I didn't want Rudy necessarily as a partner. I was 21, he was 39. I thought he was so old. But anyway, it cemented my, coming out. So I get into medical school, and of course, I'm not going to do anything like I did with Rudy. I keep my nose to the grindstone, and there's a lot of studying. And so I go through the first 2 years are all classroom. Then as you start your third year, you do your clinical rotations in various hospitals. And in winter of 1973, so I'm finishing up my second year, the university had introduced a novel course called Sexual Attitudes Readjustment, and it was designed to desensitize medical students over sexual matters so that when they dealt with patients who came in who might be gay or trans or bi or have STIs that were acquired in an unusual way, that the physician wouldn't freak out and condemn the patient and say, get out of my practice, and could treat them with dignity and not have this look, when the patient came in, because that certainly undermines their confidence in your diagnosis. So this took place in a huge carpeted warehouse where we sat on the floor and had a bunch of pillows, and you could put one on your lap if you needed to, because they showed us porn films for a whole weekend. It was Friday through Sunday afternoon, and on this 30-foot wall they showed anywhere from 15 to 20 porn films, arts films, other types. They weren't all sexual films, but there were straight, gay, and kinky, and bestiality, and lesbianism, and three ways, and four ways, and every kind of sexual thing you could think of. They showed us, and of course, what was nice about this is they showed them all at the same time at times. Sometimes they showed them more individually or just a few, but you could focus on the one you were interested in. I looked at all the gay ones and I ignored the straight ones, but nobody knew I was doing that because it was dark. We would then break off into small groups and discuss what we saw and how we felt and how would we deal if a patient came in with that sort of history. And of course, quickly the religious fanatics and people raised in the very conservative religions showed up. There weren't as many in Minnesota as there would be out in, say, Mormon country or down in the South, but we did have some fundamentalists in our class and overzealous Christians, which back then wasn't a very popular thing. It's much more popular politically nowadays. So they needed to do a lot of work, and the rest of us sort of said that too. Though I had no problems with it. However, this gave me the license to come out, because my big fear had been the medical school will reject me. And well, now they're just telling me that being gay is okay. In fact, this program was run by a very out gay man who had been a minister, who of course lost his position because he was gay, and he had developed a new career conducting these seminars and counseling people about coming out. So the very next weekend, the Friday night was March 3rd, my mother's birthday, 1973, I went to the gay bar in St. Paul. I knew where it was. I'd driven by it many times. I parked out and across the street from it, hoping to catch somebody I knew going in there so I could say, aha, and take me in too. So I went in. I looked at all the people. My eyes were open. I'm thinking, oh my goodness, these are my people. And I saw some Nelly Queenie acting people, and I saw some very normal masculine guys. And of course I was more attracted to them. And I got a drink from the bartender, and I looked way to the end of the bar, and there was this gorgeous woman with beautiful outfit and hair all floofed up and makeup, and boy, she was something else. And I thought, why is she in here? Because I sort of knew what lesbians looked like, and I thought they looked more, as my mother used to say, mannish, and dressed in blue jeans and checkered shirts. And I said, what's that gorgeous woman doing in here? And he looked at me and he goes, honey, he said, you're new, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I am. He said, that's a drag queen. So I found out what a drag queen was that night. A guy that I talked to all evening said, come on home with me. And we went home and had oral sex. And once he was done, he said, well, I'm going to bed. Yeah, you can hang out here if you want to till morning. And, we'll talk. And by about 4 a.m. I thought, I think I'll just go home. So I went back to my medical fraternity. So that was my coming out guy. And so I was okay with it. So I thought, okay. So every weekend I went back to the townhouse. I met my first boyfriend, Joe, good-looking blonde Scandinavian guy, and I actually got introduced to him by some other people I had met in the meantime. I guess I had probably gone home with them first. So, he did these one-night stands. It was called tricking out, because that was the only thing you could do back then. I quickly found that there were about 3 places you could meet people. You could cruise in a park like the Mississippi River Flats, or Rice Park in downtown St. Paul or Loring Park in downtown Minneapolis. However, parks could be dangerous, especially after dark, and it didn't appeal to me. You could cruise the tea rooms, which were, of course, the men's bathroom at Montgomery Ward's and J.C. Penney and various ones at the university, tap your foot under the partition, and that didn't appeal to me either. So being able to socialize, talk with somebody, maybe even get to know them at the bar a few times before you went home with them worked out better for me. And so when I spotted Joe, I asked my friend Gary, I said, do you know him? Oh yeah, I know him, I'll introduce you. So we hit it off, went home, and as it turned out, he was married but getting ready to file a divorce because he found out it was a mistake. He'd gotten his wife pregnant thinking that having a baby would fix things. No, it didn't. He said, I had a horrible feeling as I was walking down the aisle I was making a mistake, and a year later he was right. So he had to move out, and here his wife was right at the end of her 9th month, ready to give birth. And in fact, she did give birth about 2 weeks after we moved in together. In fact, I was in the waiting room while she gave birth. So Tara, the daughter, is now 47 years old. So Joe and I got an apartment, we moved in together. This triggered a reaction in my parents, who lived 100 miles away still in Olivia. Why did I move out of the medical fraternity in the spring? I said, well, I just wanted to get an apartment, and I met a friend who needed a roommate, so we got an apartment. And my mother was a very suspicious, skeptical, investigative type, and she just didn't leave it at that. So my sister lived in St. Paul in a suburb and was married. Her husband was now working as a international salesman for novelty items, and he had to go to Holland and Germany and Belgium to buy these things. So under the ruse that he had something in German he couldn't understand, he wanted to bring it over for me to translate. And of course, back in those days, there was no Google Translate. You couldn't look it up in a dictionary. You actually needed somebody who spoke the language to help you out. So it made sense. But otherwise, I never socialized with my sister and the family other than at holidays. We didn't get together for dinners, and we didn't go back and forth to each other's houses, even though we lived in the same city. So they'd come over, and I'm kind of suspicious about why they're coming over, and so they come over and they hand me the piece of paper, and it was like one paragraph, and so I read it to them in English. And while I was doing that to my brother-in-law, my sister was looking, and she saw that it was a one-bedroom apartment with a double bed. And so, okay, goodbye. A few days later, I get a phone call from my mother summoning me home. She said, let's get the cards out on the table. And I thought, okay. She put my sister up to that. And my sister has reported back that I'm living with a guy and we're sleeping in the same bed. So I knew I was being outed without even thinking about when I was going to do it, without going through all the years and years that a lot of the young people nowadays go through. I literally was outed within 3 weeks of my own coming out, or moving out in with my first boyfriend. So it was really within 8 weeks of my coming out. So the 2-hour drive home, I'm kind of preparing myself for what's going to happen, because I was very close to my mother, more so than my father, but he was older, so we didn't have as much in common. In fact, he was the age of most of my friends' grandparents. They were 18 years apart, and came from this immigrant background, Norwegian immigrant family in South Dakota, and my mother was raised agnostic, so she was a little more liberal, I thought, but came from a very sexually repressed family, so I don't think she had any Caribbean music. I don't think she had any ideas about whether gay was right or wrong. I'm sure she thought it was wrong. So I enter the foyer of the house, and she's standing right there, and there are 4 steps up to the dining room. My father was standing at the top of those 4 steps, and I was pounced upon immediately. All right, what's going on? I'm gay. How do you know that? It's just a phase you're going through. No, it's not a phase. I've known it my whole life. Well, when did you find out? I said, when I was 4, you took me to a wedding, and at the end of the wedding, we had to wait for something, and they were taking photos, and you said, okay, when you grow up, which one do you want to marry? And I pointed to one of the groomsmen, and I said, him. And you said, oh, ha ha ha, no, you mean the other side, where the girls are. I said, no, I want to marry him. And I said, you may not remember that, but I remember it very clearly. And I said, there's a reason why I've never dated girls. Well, my father said then, you don't know about sex. He said, you can't have proper sex. You need to have, and this is something I almost laughed out loud. He said, in order to have sex, you have to have vaginal pull. All my friends and I still laugh about this. And so I guess he was telling me that you can't have an orgasm without a woman's vagina pulling on your penis. And I said, really? And, I had learned some interviewing techniques, and so I knew open-ended statements rather than confrontational questions or deflections were better used. So I said, I looked at him and I said, oh, really? Now to add a little bit in, by this time I had been with a girl once I dated, and she didn't want to have sex. And then when I came back from Germany, she'd had a boyfriend. She'd lost her virginity. She invited me over. She was my first, and I did have sex with a woman. And then I dated my friend Jim's younger sister, who was in pharmacy school while I was in medical school, and he needed somebody to go to the dinners and then social events. And we had sex maybe for about 2 months, maybe 7 times, something like that. And then that's when I came out. I was coming out right while I was dating her. And she sort of figured it out. She said, are you gay? I said, how do you know? She says, well, your mind seems to be somewhere else while we're having sex. And I said, yeah, it is. I'm thinking of guys. So, but I didn't tell my parents that. I think I might have said, yeah, I've had some experience, and it wasn't what I wanted. And so then my mother, she said, oh, then it became all about her. She said, oh, I just can't live with this. I think I just want to get in a car and just keep driving. And so, being a Gemini and always having a smart-ass remark, I said, well, which way would you go? Like to Iowa or to Wisconsin or maybe South Dakota? She couldn't answer it. I said, but I think you'd probably eventually come back, wouldn't you? And she said, and I said, I still love you. I'm kind of doing the thing in reverse. And well, she said, you'll never give us grandchildren. And I said, you have 4 grandchildren. What's wrong with them? And well, I want your grandchildren. I said, maybe I'll get a dog. Because I had a dog as a kid. Well, my father was staying on the anatomical side of things. And so I'm standing next to my mother, and we're both looking up at him at the top of the stairs. So he decided he would take it a step further. And he said, well, he said, you don't take it in your mouth, do you? And I'm sure he and my mother probably never did anything like that, because the look on her face kind of told me that. So I thought, okay, I need to enlist a partner here. So I looked at my mother and I said, do you really want to talk about this? And she goes, no. She said, we don't need to talk about that. Well, he didn't stop. He said, well, you don't take it in your bottom, do you? And at this point, I had not done that. So, and I didn't have much interest in doing it at that point. And so it was very easy to be very indignant and look at him and say, no. And I looked at my mother. I said, you want to talk about this? And no. she's sputtering away on how her life is ruined and my father's going through the anatomy book. Well, then he made the fatal mistake. He said, I don't know how you can even think about that. He says, back when I was like 15, now my father was born in 1895, so this is 1910 this happened. Back when I was about 15 on the farm, one of my friends took me out in the back 40 along the fence line, and he said, let's do this. And he, we somehow got their pants down, and the guy had anal sex with my father, or tried to. And he said, I didn't like it one bit. And I thought, ooh, my opportunity. I looked at my mother, and her eyes were big as saucers. And I said, you did what? And I looked at my mother and I said, can you believe that? He did that? And she just turned pale. And my father, the muscles in my father's face just fell totally, like, in defeat, because he knew he'd made a big mistake. Because my mother and I were a little closer, we ganged up against him on that. And that was the end of the discussion. So then the rules were laid down. Well, you're not bringing him out here. And I said, okay, you don't want to meet him, that's fine. He's a nice guy. And I said, right now I'm, dealing with this, so we just won't see each other for a while. But, maybe I'll come out for a Sunday dinner sometime in the future. And I said, I'm very happy, and what's the medical school going to think? I said, well, the medical school is what outed me. So I told them about the seminar, and so they couldn't argue with that. So they were just totally confused, and I said, I still love you. And I hugged my mother. My father wasn't a huggy type, but, I looked at him into the eyes, and I said, goodbye, we'll be in touch. And I got in my car and drove back. And about 5 months later, it became obvious that Joe and I didn't have anything in common intellectually. And even though we had good sex, that wasn't going to sustain a relationship. And he had daddy issues, and he decided to go to a burgeoning gay church that was opening up. And I wasn't interested. So he went to the service, and I guess he had eyes for this greasy old guy who was the minister, who was really old, 49 years old. But I'd seen a picture of him, and he was nothing to look at. But Joe fell for him. He never came home. And, of course, in those days, there were no cell phones, so you couldn't call. You couldn't find out what was going on. But I figured out something had happened. And then through my friends, I found out that he had taken off with this guy and gone to Iowa or South Dakota or somewhere. And he eventually came back to town, and we had the apartment lease, and I said, well, I've got a friend from French class who needs to move out of his family's house, so we'll transfer it over to the 2-bedroom next door, and you're off the lease. And he said, you can keep my furniture. And I said, okay. And we parted ways. And so my friend Jim from French class moved in, and we weren't partners, we were just friends. And so that happened around Labor Day. And so I go back to the townhouse, and on October 20th, this handsome blonde Norwegian guy in a bright red sweater with stark white jeans and white buck shoes walked up to me and said, hi, he says, I know you from Ramsey Hospital. Well, that's where I was doing my medical student rotations. As it turns out, his name was Randy. He was in nursing school there, and he'd ridden behind me in the elevator a couple times and then had seen me at the townhouse. And even right now, the hairs in my arms and the back of my neck stand up, because he had instantly fallen in love with me. I was skeptical and gun shy at that point because I'd been dumped just 6 weeks before. But, we went home to my new apartment and just had the most wonderful sex and cuddling and stay overnight, and he made me breakfast in the morning. He was a good cook. And he became my partner. We were together 26 years. His family was from a small town in northern Minnesota. They had a lake place near Bemidji. They, without him ever coming out to his parents, they just figured out what was going on. It was never discussed. They accepted me fully. His sister, who was 3 years younger, lived in California, and she eventually came back and married a man that she had met there. They had 2 boys, and they named them Randy and Jeffrey after us. My partner died in '99 of cancer, but I'm blessed to still have my in-laws. My nephews, who are now in their early 30s, are wonderful young men, and I'm involved in their lives and their family. My sister is still living. She's 87, and all of my nieces and nephews are over 50 and have children of their own, totally accepting of us over all these years. And my parents, of course, are gone, and my own family was very small. My mother had one sister who was very homophobic, and my mother stood up to her, and I was so glad, because my mother totally accepted Randy during my father's terminal illness, which was during my medical residency in 1977. He died of leukemia. He was in the hospital where I was doing my residency training in family practice, and my mother stayed with us in our condo. And her other exclamation that day of coming out was, "Well, you're never going to have another decent meal the rest of your life," suggesting, without a wife, nobody would cook for me. Well, Randy was a wonderful cook, and so she lived with us for about 6 weeks while my dad was in the hospital, and she'd come home, I'd come home from work, Randy would come home from work in the ER and make a wonderful meal, and she'd say, "Oh, this is just scrumptious, this is wonderful," and I'd say, "Yes, another wonderful meal I'll never have." And we'd laugh about it. So she bonded well with him, and that was it. So my aunt got it between the eyes from her when it was my grandmother's 75th birthday, or maybe it was 80th birthday. Anyway, out at the family lake cabin, and she said, "Well, Jeff can come, but not that horrible Randy." And my mother just laid into her and said, "That's just not right." So we both came, and my cousins were okay with it, even though my female cousin became a fundamentalist later on. She, in her own loving Christian way, she accepts us. So that's my story. I'm at 71 now, single. I have lived in Mexico for the last 10 years before I came here, and I moved there with my friend Dave from grade school. He had come out later on, and I introduced him to one of my friends. It was Gary, the one who introduced me to Joe, and they fell instantly in love and were together for 14 years. Gary died of AIDS in 1988. He and Dave both were infected in 1981 before tests were out and we knew what it was. Dave, however, survived full-blown AIDS in 1996, got on the triple cocktail, and lived through. His second partner died in 2007. He was not financially stable to continue with their business in Dallas. He had to sell it. I said, "Come on, live with me. Let's check out Mexico, because on your small Social Security income, you can probably buy everything you need. I'll pay for the big things. We'll just live together and go back to collecting stamps." And we had a common interest in classical music and theater, opera. He was a real opera buff, much more than I was. and it worked out fine. I spoke Spanish. I had learned it during after my medical career. I ran a bed and breakfast in Phoenix, and my one employee only spoke Spanish, so I got my Spanish book out and relearned it, and had 10 years of Spanish, and now I've had 20 years of Spanish, so I speak it probably more fluently than I do German. Dave and I lived together in Mexico 7 years. Unfortunately, he had a very severe stroke in 2017 that involved the brainstem. It paralyzed him from the neck down and half of his head, and he lived about 2.5 months after that, just knowing the right half of his head and being able to see and hear and understand, but unable to talk. So I cared for him at the nursing home, read him stories. Friends went up and read him stories. His siblings sent emails, and I said, just recount funny things you did as a child. And I'd read him some of the stories his brothers and sister would send, and the only reaction he could have was a slow smile. And he would go, like that. That was the only reaction he could have. We couldn't even teach him to blink his eyes for yes or no. And he ended up dying on my birthday in 2017. So I'll never forget that. We arrived on Mexico on his birthday in 2010. It sounds very karmic, and so maybe it is. So I'm once again single. I have a lot of interests that wouldn't interest anybody else. I watch a lot of YouTube videos that have to do with linguistics, languages. I practice my German, Spanish, French, and Dutch on YouTube videos. I also took Russian, but that's a little tougher and more remote. So I try to keep the other 4 up. Here on Seba, all 4 of those languages are spoken. So I can speak Spanish with the people from Colombia and the Dominican Republic, and try a little Dutch with the local people because it is their second language. There are some French people here, and I don't think a partner would be interested in sitting through watching things that they can't understand in their own language. So I have friends here. I've been vacationing here for 37 years. Randy and I came here almost every year until he got ill. And I know a lot of people here. Many of them, of course, have passed on. But I know a lot of history of the place, and I fit in with this small community. It's an island of 1,600 people and 400 medical students, because there's a first 2-year medical school here. Because of the pandemic, these students left, and now they're slowly coming back for new courses, starting out new courses. We're doing well as our little community. It's totally safe here. You can leave your keys in your car. You don't have to lock your house. Everybody knows who you are. I accidentally left my wallet at the ATM in town, and within 10 minutes, somebody had figured out where I lived and brought it back to me. So that's life on this little island. That's my coming out story. It's completely different than modern society, but I think young people coming out, I don't know if they can get much help from what I went through, because you probably don't have sex first and then figure out the relationship and then come out. It's done another way around. But this was the way it was back in the 70s and 80s and 90s, and it could be dangerous because of cruising in those dangerous areas or picking up the wrong person. And of course there was a lot of prejudice against us, and so in my lifetime I've seen an awful lot change for the better. Had Randy and I been young people now, I'm sure we would have been married. We had a monogamous relationship, which saved my life, because we got together in 1973 to 1999, and that predated AIDS and went right through AIDS, and we didn't have safe sex. We didn't need to, and we could have both become a victim of AIDS had we not been monogamous. So that was good karma, or the angels and God were looking over me. So that's my story. Thanks for listening. Bye from Jeff.